The old journals say the winter of 1826 didn't simply arrive in the Central Rockies. It descended the way a wounded animal curls its body over a nest it intends to crush. Trappers later wrote that the sky turned to iron and that even the rivers seemed to flinch. It was the kind of winter the mountains give only once or twice in a lifetime, a winter that carves itself into memory deeper than any blade. Up on a timbered bench above the South Platte tributaries lived a man named Elias Turner, 53 years old, and already something of a ghost to the valley folk. Elias had spent more than 3 decades roaming these mountains, trapping mending tools and memorizing every quirk of wind and stone. Some said he'd gone half wild. Others whispered he knew too much about how to survive for any man to be entirely sane. But no one denied one fact: when the mountains turned hostile, Elias Turner always came through alive. That autumn, while his neighbors split pine logs and patched roofs with pitch, Elias did something no one could make sense of. Instead of stacking firewood higher, he began building a strange second skin around his cabin-layered mats of dried alpine grass bound tight with rawhide strips and pressed into thick panels. At the cabin's base, he dug a trench to fill with rounded river stones carried up from the valley floor. From a distance, the structure looked less like a home and more like a shelter an animal might build, dense, low-armored against the wind. Neighbors laughed. Some pitied him. A few offered warnings he didn't ask for, but Elias went on working in silence, his breath white in the cooling air, his hands moving with the practiced certainty of a man repeating something taught long before, because he was repeating something an old Highland teaching about warmth stone and the stubbornness required to outlast a winter no one else believed was coming. From the lower cabins scattered along the valley floor, folks could see what Elias Turner was doing from half a mile away. Even through the thinning November light, the scene looked ridiculous. A 53-year-old mountain man stacking mats of grass, actual grass, against the walls of his cabin as if he were nesting like a meadowlark preparing for spring. Every few minutes he'd step back, study the angle of the mats, then press them tighter with a wooden mallet he carved from juniper. To men who prided themselves on straight-cut logs and neatly chinked seams, it was a sight that bordered on foolishness. "He's wrapping that place like a Christmas ham," one trapper muttered at the trading post. "More like building a coffin," another replied. "All that dry grass, one spark, and he's done for." A carpenter named Lyle Brennan rode up the slope one afternoon just to watch. Lyle had built cabins in 3 territories and considered himself something of an expert. He sat his horse with an air of pity, shaking his head. "Elias, you keep going like that, and the mice will take over before winter does." Elias only nodded, hammering another panel in place. He didn't bother explaining that alpine grass cut before full maturity and pressed tightly left no air for pests to breathe, let alone nest. He didn't explain that fire risk drops when the material is compressed beyond ignition. And he certainly didn't explain why the old Scots mountain folk believed that a wall without breath should be given a second skin. People didn't want explanations. They wanted Elias to accept their certainty. But Elias Turner had lived long enough to know that certainty is often the first thing winter strips away. He'd watched men freeze in cabins they believed well built. He'd seen roofs crack under temperature swings, and he'd carried more than one half-frozen trapper back to camp because their pride outweighed their preparation. So when the laughter carried up the slope on the cold air, Elias let it pass over him like wind over stone. Because the mountains weren't listening to the valley's opinions, they were listening to his walls. As Elias packed another mat of alpine grass against the log wall, a familiar scent rose, dry, fiber-cold air, and a faint sweetness from sap still locked inside the stems. The smell carried him back half a lifetime, across an ocean into the damp shadows of the Black Forest, where he had first learned that warmth was not something you waited for. It was something you built. He could still see his grandfather's house, a low, earth-hugging shelter built into a hillside, its front wall stone, its back wall swallowed by soil, thick bundles of grass, clay-packed joints, and a hearth that never fully went cold. It wasn't a pretty house, no fine beams or carved trim like the wealthy families, but it had survived storms that cracked richer homes wide open. On the coldest nights, the wind would scream through the pines above them, shaking branches so hard that snow fell like breaking glass. Inside, though, the air stayed warm enough that little Elias could sleep with his hands uncovered. His grandfather would sit by the coals sharpening a knife or patching boots and say, "Stone holds heat. Grass keeps it. Soil hides it from the wind." That's how mountain people stay alive. At the time, Elias didn't understand the science, how thermal mass soaked up warmth slowly, how dense fibers trapped still air, how earth shielding reduced heat loss to almost nothing. But he understood the results when the blizzard came. The poor families with thick, ugly walls stayed warm. The rich families with tall windows and thin timbers did not. Those memories stayed with him long after he left Europe. Through the fur trade, through lonely winters in the Rockies, through every storm that reminded him the mountains had rules older than any carpenter's handbook. So when neighbors mocked the strange second skin he gave his cabin, Elias only smiled faintly. He wasn't inventing anything. He was remembering the only kind of house that had ever protected him. Most homesteaders in the valley thought hay was something you fed to horses or stuffed into a mattress. But up at 8,000 feet, the mountains grew a very different kind of grass. Bunch grass, wheatgrass, needle fescue, tough stems, hardened by thin air, short summers, and winds sharp enough to peel bark from juniper. These grasses didn't bend. They resisted. They didn't rot easily. They carried silica and natural waxes that made them shed moisture like a mule shakes off rain. Elias knew this. He had watched these grasses survive frost so deep it cracked granite, and he knew they held something more valuable than feed. They held stillness. Every stem, when pressed tightly, created a pocket of trapped air, and trapped air packed dense was worth more than any frontier chinking or fine-cut timber when winter came hunting. He harvested them early before the seed heads dried when the fibers were still flexible. Using a tool he fashioned from an old beaver trap spring, he compressed the grass into mats, nearly 3 inches thick, then bound them with rawhide cured in cold creek water. When set together, the mats behaved almost like wooden shingles, interlocking, resisting sag, tightening with every temperature drop. But the real secret sat beneath the walls. Elias dug a trench around the cabin's perimeter, 2 feet deep, lined with bark and filled with polished river stones hauled from the South Platte tributary. Each stone fit the size of his palm, chosen not for beauty, but for density. He knew from childhood that stones warmed slowly but surrendered heat, even more slowly, bleeding it back into the ground through the night like a buried ember. Neighbors thought he was trying to pretty up his foundation, but Elias wasn't decorating anything. He was building a thermal reservoir, a heat bank under the soil, one that would keep giving long after the last log in the stove burned down to ash. This wasn't guesswork. It was mountain engineering passed through generations. Word travels fast in a valley where winter boredom sharpens everyone's curiosity. By the second week of Elias's strange construction, 3 men rode up the slope not out of malice, but with the righteous confidence of people who believe they understand the world better than the one they came to help. First was Lyle Brennan, the carpenter, who had built half the cabins from Fort Laramie to the Platte Forks. He arrived with a tone that mixed pity and irritation. "Elias," he called out barely off his saddle, "you stack that grass any higher and you'll be living inside a tinderbox. One stray ember and you'll be roasting like a Sunday hog." He expected the comment to stir laughter. Elias only tucked another rawhide knot into place. Next came Tom Weaver, a trapper who had once wintered with Elias years back. He dismounted with less bravado but more concern. "Old friend," he said quietly, Mice will eat you out of house and home. They'll tunnel through that grass before the first snowfall." Elias shook his head gently. "They can't chew what they can't breathe in." He answered an explanation that satisfied neither man. Finally, Reverend Cole, whose small church sat near the cottonwoods, rode up wearing the weary expression of someone intervening in a neighbor's misstep. "Son," he began, though Elias was older, "a man's judgment weakens when he spends too much time alone. Why not stop this experiment and join the community in preparing properly?" Elias leaned his mallet against the wall, stretched his back, and studied the three men, not with defensiveness but with patience carved from decades of mountain winters. "You all speak from experience," he said, "but tell me how many of you spent nights above 9,000 feet? How many watched a cabin freeze from the floor up by dawn?" The question settled over them like falling snow. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply returned to pressing grass into the wall, each strike of the mallet a quiet reminder. A man who has survived enough winters no longer debates about cold, he prepares for it. By late November, Elias's cabin no longer looked like the traditional frontier shelter people expected. From a distance it resembled a compact earth-colored fortress, low to the ground, thick-shouldered, wrapped in a second layer of woven grass that hugged every inch of the log walls. What the valley saw as strangeness, Elias understood as purpose. Every component worked together like parts of the same beating heart. The grass mats, compressed until a man couldn't push a thumb into them, acted as a dense insulation blanket. Unlike loose hay, which allows a currents of air to dance through it, compressed mountain grass killed air movement entirely. Each stem trapped a sliver of stillness, millions of tiny chambers, resisting the cold the way a herd of elk blocks wind in a tight formation. Behind that layer sat the log wall, already decent at retaining heat, but plagued by the same weakness all cabins shared: seams, knots, and hairline gaps that let warmth leak out by the hour. Elias's mats bridged those imperfections, smoothing the cabin's thermal profile the way a winter coat smooths a man's outline against the wind. Beneath the structure, the Riverstone Trench played its quiet role. Every hour the stove burned, heat seeped downward and warmed the stones. And when the fire dimmed late at night, early at dawn, those same stones released the stored warmth back upward. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't fast, but it was steady, far steadier than any stack of split pine or cottonwood could provide. Then came the design few, noticed Elias's choice to keep his cabin small. A tighter footprint meant less surface area for heat to escape. A compact space warms faster, loses slower, and behaves almost like a living organism conserving energy. Together, these pieces formed what modern engineers would call a thermal envelope, a cabin that resisted the cold instead of surrendering to it. But Elias didn't know that term. He simply knew what worked when the mountains stopped showing mercy. In the Rockies, storms do not always announce themselves with thunder. Sometimes the first warning comes from things that have no voice at all. And as November bled into December, Elias Turner began noticing signs that every other man in the valley overlooked. The mule deer were the first to speak, though not with sound. Instead of grazing the open meadows, they pressed themselves along the eastern slopes, bunching tightly in places where the morning sun lingered longest. That was a habit Elias had only seen before winters that cut deep enough to kill the old and the young alike. Then the creek changed its behavior. It didn't freeze not yet, but the movement slowed in a way that defied logic. In cold years, water ran sharp and quick. In deadly years, however, it thickened not from ice, but from pressure in the air. Mountain folk called it the river holding its breath. Another morning, Elias found pine needles lying perfectly still on branches, coated in a crystalline sheen even though the temperature had risen above freezing. No drip, no melt, as if the forest itself had paused. But the final sign came from the sky, Not the clouds Elias expected those, but the absence of ravens. Normally the loudest creatures in the hills, they vanished all at once. No calls, no swooping silhouettes, just silence. He mentioned it to Tom Weaver in passing. Tom shrugged and said the birds had probably followed a carcass downstream. Elias didn't argue. A man hears what he expects to hear. But that night, as he checked the tension on his grass mats, Elias felt the same pressure he'd felt 20 years earlier in the Wind River Range, an otherworldly stillness, like the mountains drawing air into their lungs before unleashing something unkind. Down in the valley, families were celebrating an unusually mild start to winter. Children played outside, men repaired saddles, women hung wash to dry. But high on the slope, Elias Turner tightened his shutters and whispered to himself, "When the world goes quiet, the storm has already begun." The storm did not arrive like weather. It arrived like impact. Just before dusk on December 12th, a strange metallic glow settled over the mountains, yellow at first, then bruised purple, as if the sky itself were straining under something heavy. The wind died so quickly that the silence felt unnatural, like the whole world was waiting for a blow. And then, without warning, the blow came. A single crack echoed across the ridgeline, sharp enough to rattle dishes inside Elias's cabin. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of a massive fir snapping in the upper basin, carried miles on air, suddenly turned violent. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in less than an hour. Snowflakes the size of coins began to fall, not drifting downward but spiraling sideways as the wind awakened. By nightfall, the valley floor was a chaos of white walls and roaring air. Neighbors later swore the wind sounded like a freight wagon thrown from a cliff. Roof shingles tore away. Smoke was ripped backward down chimneys. Barn doors slammed so hard the iron hinges sheared clean off. Elias stood at his shuttered window and watched the storm build its spine. The snow wasn't falling in layers, it was moving horizontally, a river of white that erased fences, trees, even the outline of the mountain themselves. In less than an hour, visibility dropped to arm's length. The world beyond the cabin wall simply disappeared. Down in the valley, men ran outside to tie down roof beams, only to be thrown back by gusts that felt like a giant's hand. Women dragged children toward stoves that could barely fight the incoming cold. Horses screamed in the wind. Chickens froze where they perched. But inside Elias Turner's cabin, the walls held steady. The grass mats thickened the silence. The stones beneath the floor radiated calm warmth. The structure did not rattle. It did not sway. It simply endured. Outside, the first night of the worst storm in memory raged without mercy. Inside, Elias whispered a single sentence he'd learned long ago. The mountain never knocks softly. By the second morning of the storm, the valley cabins had turned into wooden iceboxes. Even the best-built homes' tight seams knew. Chinking, fresh-cut timbers struggled to keep their interiors above freezing. Families burned wood as fast as their stoves could swallow it, but the cold pressed in through every knot and crack, like fingers feeling for a pulse. Inside Elias Turner's cabin, the world followed different rules. When he opened the cast-iron stove at dawn, a gentle wave of warm air rolled out, carrying the scent of oak and last night's stew. The room temperature hovered around 64°F, steady and calm, as if the storm weren't clawing at the walls. Elias hadn't fed the fire since midnight 6 hours ago, but the heat had barely dipped. The stone reservoir beneath the floor still radiated a soft, even warmth, the kind that seeped into bones rather than scorching the air. He moved through the cabin without his coat, wearing only a wool shirt and suspenders. Even the tin cup on the table held water that hadn't frozen, a rare luxury during a mountain blizzard. He brewed coffee, the steam rising in a slow, lazy spiral. Outside, snow flew past like a river of shattered glass. Inside, the air was still enough to hear droplets fall back into the pot. What kept the room warm wasn't power or luck. It was physics made patient. The dense grass mats resisted heat loss with stubborn efficiency. The compact footprint reduced the surface area exposed to brutal winds, and the stone trench stored enough thermal energy to mimic the steady breathing of an animal sleeping underground. Elias sat at his small pine table, spooned stew into a bowl, and listened not to the storm but to the gentle creak of warm timbers expanding. It was the sound of a structure staying alive. While the valley froze, his cabin behaved like a living creature that had learned how to conserve heat better than the men who mocked it. And the storm had only just begun. By the fourth day of the storm, the valley no longer argued about whether Elias Turner was right. Survival had a way of humbling a man faster than any debate. The cold had become a living creature, one that stalked the cabins, pressed its weight into floorboards, and crawled across blankets, until even the breath of sleeping children turned to frost. The first to break was Reverend Cole. His cabin, though sturdy, was too large and too proud, high ceilings, wide windows, and a long roofline that bled heat like an open wound. On the morning of the fourth day, the Reverend wrapped his two daughters in quilts and found frost crystals forming on their eyelashes. Even with the stove roaring, the interior temperature barely reached 33 degrees. He made his choice quickly. Facing winds so violent the air seemed to slice Cole, carried both girls one under each arm, fighting through drifts that swallowed his boots. When he reached Elias's door, he didn't knock with dignity, he hammered with desperation. Elias opened it wearing no coat, warm air spilling out around him like mist from a bathhouse. The Reverend stood there, trembling shame mixing with relief. "I was wrong," he said, voice cracked and thin. Elias didn't answer with judgment. He simply stepped aside. "Warm yourselves," he said. "The walls don't care who doubted them." 2 hours later, another knock came, this time Lyle Brennan, the carpenter who once lectured Elias on proper construction. His wife followed behind, clutching a wrapped bundle that turned out to be their newborn son. The child's fingers were stiffening. Elias ushered them in without a word. He added more stones near the stove to warm, quickly pulled extra blankets from a cedar chest, and ladled stew into tin bowls. Inside that small cabin, shame thawed in the same warmth that saved their bodies. By nightfall, 3 families sought refuge in the fortress of grass and stone they once mocked, and the storm showed no sign of mercy. For 6 days the storm did not relent. It howled, it shoved, it tore at the earth with the fury of something ancient reclaiming its territory. Down in the valley, men burned through their firewood piles until nothing remained but half-broken chairs, tool handles, and the last planks torn from their barn walls. Heat came in flashes, brief, painful, unsatisfying, before the cold swallowed it whole again. Meanwhile, in Elias Turner's cramped cabin, time took on a different rhythm. Families huddled not for survival, but for warmth that felt gentle. The walls radiated a steady heat, almost like the inside of a clay bread oven. Children who days earlier had shivered beneath quilts now sat cross-legged on the floor, learning simple knot tying from Elias, their hands free of gloves for the first time since the storm began. The stove burned only 4 hours a day, 2 at dawn, 2 near dusk, yet the interior remained near 65 degrees. The river stones beneath the floor, warmed through repetition, exhaled their stored heat slowly, faithfully, like a hidden fire that never flickered. Meals simmered without urgency. Bread dough rose easily in a wooden bowl. At night, lamplight glowed against the grass-lined walls, turning the room amber and soft. The storm could roar, scream, or shake the mountains themselves, but inside Elias's cabin, conversation drifted at the pace of comfort. Still, survival wasn't the only thing happening there. Something else was thawing. Lyle Brennan, the proud carpenter, found himself staring at the walls he once ridiculed, tracing the rawhide bindings with calloused fingertips. "This shouldn't work," he murmured to Elias. "But it does." Elias smiled, a quiet curve beneath his beard. "Most things that work don't ask for permission," he replied. As the wind battered the cabin outside, Brennan sat back humbled by a truth he'd ignored for years. Nature rewards what works, not what looks proper. For 6 days, the little cabin held fast, its warmth a defiance, its silence a comfort, its survival a lesson. And the storm still was not finished. On the 7th morning, the valley woke not to wind, but to silence and eerie, heavy quiet that felt more unsettling than the storm itself. Snow no longer drifted sideways. It simply hung in the air like dust in a shuttered barn. The sun tried to claw its way through milky clouds, casting a pale, ghost-like sheen across the frozen landscape. Families emerged from their battered cabins, cautiously stepping into drifts that swallowed their legs. What they saw was not winter, it was aftermath. 7 cabins had roofs partially collapsed from ice weight or wind shear. Walls bowed outward like chests exhaling their last breath. Frost lines marked where heat had escaped, relentlessly turning timber dark and brittle. Several cabins sat empty, the families having fled during the worst nights, leaving doors unlatched and stoves cold. Behind one ruined homestead, a pasture lay still. 18 horses, once the pride of the valley, had frozen upright ice, locking their manes to the ground. In another yard, a milk cow lay curled like she'd simply gone to sleep and never woken. But the greatest losses weren't counted in animals. Near the northern slope, Lyle Brennan found the home of a young couple. Eddie and Marlene Grant collapsed inward. The couple had tried to burn furniture for warmth, but didn't make it past the 5th night. Their bodies were discovered huddled together beneath blankets stiff with frost. As grim news spread from homestead to homestead, a strange pattern emerged. The only structure completely unscathed was Elias Turner's cabin. Its walls stood straight, its shutters intact, its thermal stones still radiating warmth like a quiet pulse beneath the floor. Families who had taken refuge inside walked out with color in their cheeks, not the pale, brittle gray of cold-starved skin. That afternoon, as men gathered in stunned silence near the trading post, Reverend Cole finally spoke aloud. The truth everyone felt, but no one wanted to say. "Elias didn't just survive this storm," he said softly. He understood it. And for the first time, the valley wondered whether the man they once mocked might become the teacher they desperately needed. 2 days after the storm broke, the valley gathered outside the trading post, not for supplies, not for Sunday worship, but for answers. Men who once boasted about their craftsmanship now stood quietly, hats in their hands, the weight of lost livestock and shattered confidence hanging on their shoulders. The question none of them wanted to voice was finally spoken by Lyle Brennan, the carpenter, who once mocked Elias most loudly. "Elias, will you show us how you built it?" No pride, no sarcasm, just a man humbled by winter and desperate for understanding. Elias didn't make a speech. He simply walked to an open patch of snow-packed earth, knelt, and drew a rough outline with the tip of his glove. His movements were calm, patient, like a man repairing a net rather than teaching a valley how to stay alive. He began with the foundation trench, sketching the width and depth, explaining which river stones held heat longest and why the shape of each stone mattered. "Flat stones cool too fast," he said. "You want round bellies, same as animals. They hold warmth." Then he moved to the grass mats, demonstrating how to bind fibers in alternating directions so they wouldn't sag in thaw cycles. Men leaned closer when he explained why the grass must be cut young, why compression mattered more than thickness, and why these mats worked better than any chinking made of clay. "It isn't the grass keeping you warm," Elias said, tapping the drawing. "It's the stillness inside it." The simplicity stunned them. Next, he outlined shutter design, airflow gaps near the roofline, and the importance of building small when you can't afford to build weak. Questions poured in about fire risk, moisture pests. Elias answered each from experience, not theory. By the time he finished, The sun hovered low, and the entire valley understood something it hadn't before. Elias Turner didn't just survive the mountains, he listened to them, and they had answered back. That winter, the valley gained more than knowledge. It gained a new kind of humility. By the following autumn, the valley no longer argued about whether Elias's method worked. The only debate now was how to adapt it. Some men preferred 3-inch mats. Others pressed theirs down to 2 for easier handling. A few experimented with cattail reeds from the wetlands. But every cabin built that summer shared the same essential features: dense fiber walls, stone reservoirs, compact footprints, and shutters packed like winter coats. Then came the winter of 1827-28, harsh but not catastrophic. It served as the valley's first real test, and the results were impossible to ignore. Cabins modified with Elias's method averaged 18 to 22 degrees warmer than traditional ones. Families reported burning 40 and 60% less wood, which meant they no longer spent every waking hour splitting logs or hauling deadfall through snowbanks. Instead, they found time for sewing, storytelling, mending tools, things frontier life often squeezed out. A house built by Tom Weaver maintained a steady 50 a even during a cold snap that pushed other cabins into the low 30s. One family's newborn survived the season without the chronic frost sores that claimed so many infants in mountain settlements. And the small cabin built by Lyle Brennan, the once skeptical carpenter, surprised even him. 12 inches of compressed grass on the north wall, 10 on the others, plus a riverstone trench beneath the floor, kept his home warm enough that his wife could bake bread without her dough freezing between needs. "Feels like living inside a hearth itself," she said. By the winter of 1828-29, the method had spread to neighboring valleys, brought by traders, wandering trappers, and families who'd heard whispers of the warm cabins near Turner's Ridge. A few even traveled days on horseback just to touch the walls and see whether the tales were exaggerated. They weren't. What began as a joke, a mountain man stuffing his house with grass, had become a quiet revolution in frontier building. And unlike trends brought from the East, this one wasn't based on fashion. It was based on proof. By the early 1830s, Elias Turner's beard had turned the color of fresh snowfall, and the mountains he once roamed with youthful stubbornness now shaped his steps with quiet wisdom. His cabin still stood on the timbered bench walls, firm grass mats, intact river stones warm beneath the floor, like a heartbeat that never quite faded. Younger settlers visited more often now, riding up the slope with notebooks or scraps of charcoal paper, eager to learn what once they mocked. One crisp November morning, Elias stood outside splitting kindling when his grandson, a boy of 12, asked the question everyone eventually asked grandfather: "How did you know the storm would be that bad? And how did you know this?" The boy tapped the grass wall would work. Elias smiled, resting one hand on the boy's shoulder. "I didn't know. I remembered." He pointed toward the distant ridge where the wind combed the pines into dark waves. "These mountains don't care about our pride. They listen only to physics and humility. Men forget that. But your great-grandfather taught me something his father taught him: thick walls for warmth, stone for steadiness, small spaces for survival. Not because tradition is sacred, but because it has survived more winters than we ever will." The boy nodded slowly, absorbing each word, the way frontier children always have, with equal parts awe and responsibility. Elias continued, "Modern folk think new ideas replace old ones. But out here, the mountains test every idea the same way, by whether it keeps you alive. Fancy homes freeze, pretty homes collapse. Only the honest ones endure." As the sun dipped behind the ridge, casting long violet shadows across the snow, Elias handed the boy a bundle of young grass. "Come," he said, "I'll show you how to bind it before the stems go brittle." And so the lesson passed quietly, simply from one generation to the next. because in the frontier, survival was never about being clever. It was about remembering what worked. And the warm little cabin on Turner's Ridge stood as proof that sometimes the future depends not on invention, but on the wisdom we refuse to let die.